Every age has its own narrative myth about those who acquire great wealth. In the 21st century, the prevailing story is that of the nerd who parlays technological genius into billions. The big tech oligarchs who make their way onto the Forbes billionaire list are envied and feared. But with a few conspicuous exceptions, their cool lifestyles, liberal politics, and donations to fashionable and politically correct charities generally protect them from the worst abuse that pop culture can inflict on the famous. The nerd billionaires may sometimes be mocked, but the chattering classes still laud them for funding the causes they support. That was not the case with Sheldon Adelson. The casino magnate who died 1 year ago this week at the age of 87 was a throwback to the Horatio Alger rags to riches tales of the 19th century. But he will be remembered primarily not so much for the way he made his money, but the way he gave it away. At the time, his death was greeted with a torrent of abuse from liberals in both the United States and Israel that would otherwise been considered appropriate for the passing of a controversial politician. Along with his wife, Dr. Miriam Adelson, he gave more to Jewish causes than any other philanthropist in the first decades of the century. But rather than being chiefly remembered for this, media reactions to his death paid more attention to the money he spent on aiding the campaigns of Republican candidates whom he saw as friends of Israel. He used the access he acquired with his wealth to lobby not just Congress, but presidents and prime ministers with an unabashed zeal for bending them to his will on issues related to Israel's security. While he lavished donations on a host of medical institutions, he was most interested in funding Jewish life in Israel. Adelson was a traditional Zionist who believed in Jewish rights and wanted them to be respected by the United States. Vilified by an Israeli media establishment that leaned as hard to the left as its American counterparts, he responded by founding a free newspaper, Israel Hayom, that not only broke the liberal monopoly in that field, but became the most widely read in the country. In that same spirit, he was an early supporter of JNS. For this, he was hated by many. While his dedication to Jewish projects, like the Birthright Israel program that has sent hundreds of thousands of young American Jews on free trips to Israel, was unmatched by more centrist donors, long before his death, he had become the symbol of conservative political donors who were determined to get it their way. But lost amid the politics is something more basic. Adelson clearly saw himself as someone placed in a position granted by his good fortune in business to do something other than fitting in and playing along. In addition to embodying the entrepreneurial spirit, Adelson also possessed the mindset of American Jews whose ethnic and religious identity revolved around the memory of the Holocaust and support for Israel. Indeed, he was fond of recalling that on his first trip to Israel, something that had not occurred until after he had become wealthy, but it was Adelson's 1991 marriage to his second wife Miriam, an Israeli physician, that focused him on Zionist activism and politics. From that point on, the Jewish state would become a consuming interest into which he would not merely pour wealth, but do so in a manner that would substantially alter the course of both Israeli and American politics. The list of Israeli and Jewish institutions and philanthropic causes to which he contributed is long. But Adelson wasn't content to merely give to charities. An opponent of American pressure on the Jewish state to make concessions its people believed were dangerous to its security, he became one of the leading donors to Republican candidates as the GOP completed its transformation into a lockstep pro-Israel party. Just as Adelson's contributions to philanthropic causes were on an epic scale, with him giving hundreds of millions to various institutions, his involvement in politics was similarly grand. His donations to pro-Israel candidates and conservative Republicans were both generous and strategic. Adelson believed in a direct approach to politics. He backed those he considered faithful friends to the cause he cared about and would cut off those who didn't. It was his willingness to back Donald Trump's campaign in 2016, when most major Republican donors wanted no part of him after he secured the GOP nomination, that proved especially fateful. Adelson spent hundreds of millions on various candidates over the years, but no donation was more significant than his backing for Trump. 1 year after his death, it's worthwhile remembering Adelson's example, not just because of what he did, but because it points towards the need for other Jews with the means to follow in his footsteps with respect to embracing their identity and unabashedly pursuing the interests of their people in the Jewish state. More than any other member of his generation, Sheldon Adelson was true to the obligations that Judaism places on both the uses of wealth and on the requirement for solidarity with other Jews. He wasn't one of the cool billionaires, but his efforts still earned him an honored place among some of the most honored leaders in the annals of Jewish history.